Hello, class. We're going to focus today particularly on agriculture. And we've obviously already talked about food and agriculture as it weaves into a number of different things, most prominently in the form of biodiversity in our discussions there, because of course the expansion of agriculture being the largest single impact on biodiversity worldwide. We briefly talked about it a little bit during our climate and energy discussions, and we'll explore more thoroughly those connections today. But there's just a lot of ways, obviously, that food systems weave into these different environmental concerns as well. But let's start off and think about this question of why are humans so prevalent on the planet? And that can really be tied into the two key developments in human history. One being the agricultural revolution, obviously our capacity to harness agriculture to grow crops rather than just being hunter-gatherers really enabled human society to begin to develop whenever that was. I'm not a history person, 10,000 or so years ago. And then beyond that, the Industrial Revolution, which we have talked about quite extensively, and particularly the influence of these two things put together. So our capacity to harness agriculture and to grow crops is fundamental and laid the framework for humans to be able to begin to expand and society to form. But then once we reached the Industrial Revolution and we began to harness seemingly unlimited potential of energy resources and to be able to develop society in a way that utilized that great infusion of energy and apply that to agriculture, that's what really enabled us as a human society to significantly grow and to keep up with our ever expanding needs on the planet. We've talked a lot about our expanding needs and resource usage, and particularly when it comes to feeding and agriculture, how do we feed a human population? That's what has enabled us to do that. So how have we been able to keep up with this exponential growth? We know that human population has been growing exponentially. How have we been able to keep up with that? Because if you remember our conversations about carrying capacity, what carrying capacity concerns will point to this doesn't happen in nature. Well, and if it does, there's a significant crash afterwards. So how is it that we've been able to grow the human population very significantly without the ensuing crash, which is exactly what people like Paul Ehrlich pointed to and said, hey, the human population is about to crash because we don't see this happen in nature without it happening, and because we can't keep up with agricultural production. Well, a number of important developments have enabled us to keep up with that, beginning with mechanization. We're going to focus on four key things here, and then look at expanding artificial inputs, selective plant breeding, and improved irrigation. And those last three kind of can be combined to refer to something called the Green Revolution. But first off with mechanization. So mechanization, basically what we're talking about with this in terms of the agricultural sector is we're talking about replacing human and animal labor with machinery that's powered by fossil fuels. So what used to be these top two right here, that this is how agriculture was done more or less for many centuries, for basically all of human existence into the last couple hundred years. This, as you well can determine, is very inefficient, very hard work. The amount of production that one person can create is rather small and limited, and typically is constrained to that person's family. If you are reaping by hand and sowing and plowing with a tilling machine, just with your horses or cattle, then you're very limited in what you're able to produce. So obviously that changed significantly when we were able to develop machines to do this a lot more effectively. Another term that refers to this can be capital intensification. In other words, we've moved from human labor to capital, to machinery, to production, to mechanization. And this has significantly changed the way that agriculture happens. So in particular, think about the impacts of agricultural mechanization. It has encouraged crop specialization. The more when you have large machinery like this tomato picker right here, that mechanized process means that you're not going to have a big diversity of crops there, right? You're going to have farmers that are focused, specialized on one particular crop, because they're not going to own all the many different types of specialized machinery in order to do a great diversity of crops. If the goal is to maximize production, and these machines are very expensive, so they're going to specialize in particular areas. It encourages larger economies of scale, so farms get larger, which you can see in this graph right here. This looks at over 100 years of farm size in the United States, and you can see the size of farms in terms of acres per farm increased significantly, and the number of farms has gone down significantly. Same thing, decrease in the number of farmers. So we don't need nearly as many farmers because we have these huge machines that do what humans used to do. So we don't need farmers, which is why that the percent of Americans in agriculture sector has dropped to, I think it's 2%. It used to be around 70% a couple hundred years ago. So we have fewer farmers farming much larger tracts of land and are very specialized in what they produce. As a result, we have decreased crop diversity. So we have a lot fewer types of crops that are out there, and a lot fewer types of breeds of crops as well, which makes sense because we have created machinery to specialize in particular types of crops. And so we don't have quite the diversity that we used to. In fact, diversity has shrunk significantly. Increased production capacity and efficiency. This is the main advantage that we see in that mechanization. Obviously, it's far more efficient. I mean, look how fast this guy is picking those tomatoes. If you have people, individual humans down there picking tomatoes, it's going to be many orders of magnitude slower to do so. So this machinery is able to greatly increase how much we can produce and the efficiency with which we can produce it. On the downside, it's increased our reliance on fossil fuel inputs. So we now, what used to be done by hand or animals is now done by fossil fuel powered machinery. So that's a downside, and has decreased soil fertility and topsoil and increased topsoil loss. So some negative impacts is there as well. So mechanization overall, I mean, it makes sense. We don't want to have lots of people out in the fields picking things when the machine can do it for us. So it's a natural progression in human societal development. But there's a lot of interesting implications to that. We have fewer farmers, larger farms, more specialization, more problems related to topsoil loss, reliance on fossil fuels. But for all that, we get really increased production and efficiency in doing so. So mechanization has been a key piece of how we've been able to keep up with agricultural production and continually increase that. The other piece, and I'll lump I said four things in here. It's really kind of mechanization, and then the other three kind of lumped into the Green Revolution. So the Green Revolution is something that went on particularly during the 1950s and 60s. And it's composed of a few key components here, but it describes the process of advancements in the agricultural sector that have led to the development of what we would consider modern agriculture. And it relies upon these few key components: the development and widespread use of synthetic fertilizers, and we'll dig into each of these for the most part. Same thing for pesticides, the widespread application of pesticides on crops, seed selection and breeding, and improved irrigation. And what the Green Revolution has enabled us to do is to dramatically increase food production on a global scale. As a result of dramatically increased food production, because the more supply you have, the more the price goes down. So it has lowered the price of food production in agriculture globally, and has increased caloric intake around the world as well. So the first part of that related to fertilizers, this comes about because of something called the Haber-Bosch process. The Haber-Bosch process came about in the early 20th century. Fritz Haber, who won a Nobel Prize for this, invented the process of removing nitrogen from the air. As you know, most of our atmosphere is made up of nitrogen. And nitrogen is a crucial component in terms of plant health, and one that is quickly removed from plant production. So when we harvest crops, we're removing a lot of the nitrogen. So the plants uptake nitrogen from the soil. That's a critical element to help them grow and flourish. But a lot of that nitrogen is lost as we harvest crops. It's also lost as we lose topsoil, which, as we've talked about, is a big problem around the world as well. So nitrogen, fundamental component to agriculture, and one that's an ever shrinking supply as we are continuing our process of modern agriculture around the world. And so we needed a way to make up for that loss of nitrogen. And that's done that by Fritz Haber inventing the way of being able to synthesize ammonia by pulling nitrogen out of the air. The way this works is he uses intense pressure and temperature in order to combine nitrogen with hydrogen to produce ammonia. So that pulls nitrogen out of the air, that allows that ammonia to be used as an artificial or synthetic fertilizer, which has been critical for our ability to produce crops on a bigger scale. And in fact, if you look at this, this is a really interesting graph here. This world population in blue, which we have looked at many times, is over a 100-year time scale. And then it looks at what we could do feeding the world wise with and without synthetic fertilizers. So without synthetic fertilizer, of course, we're limited in the types of farming systems we can do because we have to find some other way to fertilize them, which typically would be manure or other plant-based products, the compost. And that is a more time-consuming process. It's a more difficult process. Now, as we'll see sort of towards the end, there are systems that can do that particularly well. But without that capacity to do this process, we would not be able to feed a world of 8 billion people. In fact, the statistics say around half that, maybe about 4 billion people we could feed without this. So this is critical. The Haber-Bosch process is one of the most important developments in human society, enabling us to feed the world that we are today. We couldn't feed the world without this ability to provide synthetic fertilizers. And as you can see, synthetic fertilizer use is growing dramatically. And that's in part because population has been growing dramatically. Also in part because we've been working hard to reduce hunger globally. And this has helped us to make big strides in that respect as well. Improved irrigation is another key. I don't have a separate slide for increased pesticide use, but similar with the fertilizers, we have seen significant increases in pesticide use because that helps us increase our production. It avoids losses to crops. It's become a standard part of agriculture today. Without pesticides, we would have a lot more threats to crop productions, at least in terms of the way that agriculture is done in the traditional method that we have it today. But improved irrigation as well, new methods. Used to be that furrow irrigation or trench irrigation or gravity-fed irrigation, which you see in the middle picture there, was the standard way to go. Basically funneling water onto fields to irrigate them, but that's super inefficient. Most of that gets lost in terms of evaporation for reasons that are fairly obvious when you look at the picture. Sprinkler irrigation, which you see on the bottom, is much better and is more the standard for what you see in large farms today. But a lot of places are moving toward drip irrigation, which is much, much more efficient. You lose very little to evaporation. So from a water efficiency perspective, this has been critical and has really helped. These improvements have helped us to increase how much we're able to produce. Obviously, plants are reliant upon water to grow. And the more efficiently we can deliver water, especially in places where there's lower water stress, then the more we're able to enhance our crop production. Probably the most fundamental part of this process of the Green Revolution has been a development that was pioneered by Norman Borlaug. And essentially what Borlaug did is he followed traditional methods. Now, selective plant breeding has been around for as long as the agricultural revolution. And essentially what we're talking about there is what farmers will notice. Traditional farmers are close to the land, close to the crops, think longer periods of time ago, may notice that, hey, this particular corn stalk, we had this big drought, but this particular corn stalk did really well, or the stalks in this side of the field did really well despite the drought. Well, what those farmers would do is then they would use those stalks to breed next year's crop because they want next year's crop to be drought resistant. So they would selectively breed the kernels, the seeds from those crops in order to plant next year's crops. And over time, as you do that, you're selectively breeding for drought resistance. And traditional farmers have always done this. Well, what Borlaug did is he really applied science to this by using laboratory techniques in order to very specifically select for certain genes in different crops and to roll that out widespread around the world. So as you can see, he's received a number of different accolades around the world for this, and particularly for increasing crop yields in a few different countries. So in India, his work helped double wheat production in just 6 years, literally just the work of Borlaug in terms of enhancing better crop seed selection techniques and breeding techniques, doubled wheat production in 6 years. Mexico tripled grain harvest in 20 years. Globally, it's tripled wheat and corn over a period of 40 years. Very dramatic increases in production, which has been really important, in part because it means harvesting more product without using more space. So the more we're able to maximize the efficiency of space, then that's beneficial, and from an environmental perspective as well. So highly efficient use of land, a lot of benefits to farmers because their crops are increasing, increased disease resistance because part of the strategy here, if you're breeding particular traits into your plants, then you're breeding for disease resistance and drought resistance and all of that, and has lowered food costs. So this has been really beneficial on a global scale. This chart looks at the share of younger children under 5 who are underweight for their age over a period of a couple of decades. And as you can see, this is decreasing. And we are decreasing, we have been decreasing hunger for a long time. And this shows some of the gains that you see there. And this probably summarizes up, all of those mechanization, the Green Revolution, all the benefits gained from that. This really pulls it together into the key thing to take away from that. And that simply is that while population has been growing significantly in the last several decades, food production has matched that, if not better, that pace. So as you can see, cereal yields and production have continued to outpace population growth. This is why Ehrlich was wrong. You look at, we talked earlier about why it made sense for Ehrlich to predict catastrophe, because we know about carrying capacity. We know that we can't see exponential increases indefinitely into the future. And yet we had significant changes to the way we do agriculture that enabled us to keep pace with that. And that has been critical for meeting that need. Now, it does beg this question of how long can this be sustained? And that is not necessarily one with an easy question, with an easy answer. If you think about a cornfield, for example, or maybe you've seen a movie where people are walking through a cornfield or running through a corn. I feel like it's an iconic movie scene in so many different movies or TV shows. People walking through a cornfield. Well, have you ever tried to walk through a cornfield lately? Because nowadays, corn stalks are grown so close together, you can't fit through the rows of a cornfield. And that's because we've genetically bred the corn to grow closer together in order to have more efficient yields, in order to get more corn from the same space. Makes perfect sense. The farmer's making more money. We're growing more food on the same amount of land. That's good for sustainability. It's good for feeding people. It's good all around. The question does arise, though. There's certainly a limit to how close we can grow stalks together. If we moved from, and I don't know the numbers, let's say we moved from 18 inches to 14 inches to 12 inches to 8 inches, well, we're going to run out of that closeness. You can't have them 1 inch apart. There's just no space in the soil for the crops to grow then. So one concern with this would be, well, it's easy enough to say we'll figure out our way out of it because we have, but then you also have to look at reality and realize it's possible that the biggest gains in terms of enhancing food production we've already achieved, and that further gains are unlikely to be very significant, particularly from those kinds of perspectives. You also have to look at it and realize hunger still exists around the world. Yeah, we've made progress in a lot of important areas, but there's over 800 million people that are still hungry around the world. And that's problematic. And as your text points out, there's a lot of malnutrition too. So while the Green Revolution, your book is, I think, overly critical of the Green Revolution. Certainly there's a lot to criticize, and we'll get to the problems starting on the next slide. But I also think you can't underappreciate the importance of the Green Revolution for avoiding mass starvation. Paul Ehrlich's doom and gloom scenario of catastrophe would have happened if not for the Green Revolution. We would have had tens, if not hundreds of millions of deaths from starvation. if we hadn't had the Green Revolution. So you can't underestimate the importance of that. That said, it has resulted in more malnutrition, for example, because people's diets are much less diverse. They're relying a lot more on staple crops, crops like corn and rice, which are not particularly nutritious, but are calorie dense. And so people are getting their calories, but they're not getting the nutrients that they need to really thrive. And this is malnutrition is referred to as the hidden hunger. And when you look at hidden hunger, here's a map that shows around the world. See a lot of places, one moment. Excuse me. A lot of places around the world, you see, particularly sub-Saharan Africa and South Asia, you see malnutrition is a really big problem. This hidden hunger in preschool children is quite high in some places. And interestingly, on this graph here, so you see share of energy, that's caloric intake, from cereals, roots, and tubers. So these are those like staple crops, corn, wheat, rice. So the further to the right you go, the more your calories are coming from just the staple crops. In other words, the less diverse a diet you're getting. And the higher on the y-axis you go, the more malnutrition there is. So as you can see, the greater the percentage of the culture that gets their calories from staple crops, then the higher the malnutrition exists in those places. So this is a sort of a hidden problem that's there. And that, yeah, we've done a good job of getting the calories we need around the world, though there's still over 800 million people who don't have that. But a lot of the people who have the requisite calories are not getting the requisite nutrients. And so that's a problem as well. So it's kind of masking some of the challenge there. But beyond that concern of just straight up feeding the world's population, because we've got to feed the world, we've got to address hunger, that's critically important. But we also have to do it in a sustainable way. It's not helpful if we simply figure out how to get calories in people if we are destroying our ability to continue to feed people beyond just the current generation. And there's a lot of problems with the modern agriculture system. So we're going to dig into some of these and we'll infuse some solutions to those as well. Agriculture is responsible for 80% of deforestation around the world. About a third of global greenhouse gas emissions come from the agriculture sector once it's all combined up with all the other ways that it impacts the world. 70% of terrestrial biodiversity loss, 70% of water use. It goes on and on and on. So the environmental impacts of the agriculture sector are enormous, as you would expect, right? Feeding humans is the most fundamental of activities that humans undergo, right? If you boil everything down to its essence, feeding yourself is the most important thing that you could do. So it makes sense that agriculture would have a big impact on the world. Unfortunately, as we've learned, we're transgressing planetary boundaries. We are putting our planet in peril in a lot of different ways. And so the food system plays a big part of that. So we need to find a way to do the food system in a more sustainable manner because food system is critically important. So we need to find a way to do it sustainably. One of the biggest concerns relates to greenhouse gas emissions from agriculture. Around a third or so, once you look at the total food system itself, including the production of food, transportation of food, the land system change that comes from expanding agriculture and deforestation. It accounts for about a third of overall emissions together. And around half of that, about 15%, comes just from the livestock sector. And that's really significant as well, particularly from cattle being the biggest piece of that. And a large part of that is simply because cattle, their stomachs undergo a process called enteric fermentation, which basically, you've heard about how cows have 4 stomachs and how they kind of digest and then redigest their food. Well, that process of digesting and redigesting, and particularly the burping that comes from that, which is part of the process, creates a lot of methane. Methane is 30 times stronger than CO2 at trapping heat, sorry. And we have more than 1 billion cows in the world. So in short, the cattle industry is creating a whole lot of methane that's trapping a lot of heat and is a big contributor to global warming. On top of that, more than a third of crop production around the world goes to feed animals, not to feed humans actually. So a very significant chunk of our plant-based agriculture actually goes to feeding animals, not just to feeding humans themselves. The production of artificial fertilizers through that Haber-Bosch process. Remember how we talked about the Haber-Bosch process requires intense heat and pressure in order to bring that ammonia, to condense the ammonia out of the air. Well, that intense heat and pressure ends up resulting in about 1 to 2% of global greenhouse gas emissions. So remember, that's almost as much as the aviation sector. So it's a little more than half of the aviation sector. So and that's just the process of synthesizing ammonia. So the process of synthesizing ammonia for fertilizer itself is more than half of the emissions of the aviation sector. So that's remarkable and a little known component. In addition, nitrogen-based fertilizers, when they are spread on crops, only a small portion of that actually gets taken up by the crops themselves. A lot of that gets broken down or washed off in the soils. And what happens is that the bacteria break down those nitrogen compounds and release nitrous oxide emissions into the atmosphere. Nitrous oxide is even way worse than ammonia. It's 300 times stronger than carbon dioxide at trapping heat. So those nitrous oxide emissions that get released in the atmosphere due to bacteria breaking down artificial fertilizers is a big contributor as well to greenhouse gas emissions. This is just an interesting little picture of a cow. They're measuring the methane emissions from this cow in order to find ways to reduce that. And looks at nitrous oxide levels. As you can see, just like with CO2 levels, we see sharp increase since the Industrial Revolution. Now, there are some interesting experiments being undergone. University of California, Davis put out a study just this past year that showed that feeding cattle seaweed can actually greatly reduce the amount of methane emissions. In fact, 1% changing their diet to include 1% seaweed into their grain-fed diet will reduce greenhouse gas emissions by 82% from that. So fascinating. I'm really interested to see where this goes in the future, because a huge chunk of the carbon footprint of meat, and particularly beef, comes from those methane emissions from enteric fermentation. Well, if seaweed can reduce that 82%, that greatly reduces the carbon footprint of beef. Now, this is not out there. Don't say, yay, I'm going to go out and eat a bunch of beef. It's not out there yet. But keep your eye on this in the news. It'd be interesting to see how this impacts things. Maybe I'm always skeptical and reluctant of like these kind of things that sort of seem silver bullet solutions. So I'm cautious until it gets out there, but I would love to see this get out and be successful. I hope it is. The other component of nitrogen that's disturbing, and we already talked about this when we talked about dead zones with water, is that nitrogen, what happens is when it gets washed out in river systems, it gets washed out to the ocean, and then it causes a spurt in algae growth in the ocean, because that nitrogen, that's a fertilizing thing. It really like supercharges algae growth in the area. And then all those algae die off, and it creates a hypoxic environment in the ocean around there. So you have these large hypoxic environments or dead zones, particularly around the mouths of major river systems like the Mississippi River Delta right here. And that creates problems for fishing industry, shrimp industry, and any other wildlife in the ocean that is around there. So that's a problem with the nitrogen solution. Here's an interesting one. I have a number of videos I really wanted to include in here, but as usual, didn't have really time for it. Precision agriculture is a new thing that is really kind of cutting edge technology in the agriculture sector. And what it does is it uses things like satellites and drones and apps in order to provide precise levels of fertilizers, insecticides, even water in a field in order to provide exact amount in the right spot. Because as you can imagine, if you look at a field, not every part of a field needs the same amount of the same resource. Places that are a little lower in the valley probably need less water because you got some water collecting down there. Places on the top probably need more. Maybe places around the edges might need more or less insecticide. Maybe they're more vulnerable there. Some places, just because the soil composition will be richer in nitrogen, whereas others will be poorer. And yet the way that conventional farming is done today is that it's just all mass spread, right? You just spread insecticide equally across your fields because there's no way you can know that prior to the technology age. Same thing for irrigation, same thing for nitrogen and fertilizers. Well, what precision agriculture does is it uses satellites, uses drones in order to get very fine level, even down to the square foot level, to determine what is needed throughout an entire field. And then to distribute that either through connected tractors, autonomous connected tractors, or through drones themselves in order to deliver the exact amount of fertilizers, insecticides, pesticides, water, irrigation to those places. Now, the great benefit of doing that is that it significantly reduces the amount of those things that are needed. So we've talked about how pesticides are problematic, how artificial fertilizers, while critical for feeding the world, also create a ton of ecological problems. And water stress is a major issue. Well, if you can, without diminishing crop yields, reduce how much of that you're doing, then you've just solved a ton of problems. In fact, if you can not just without reducing, if you can actually increase crop yields and decrease how much water, fertilizer, pesticide you're using, then that's a win-win scenario all around. That's exactly what precision agriculture is doing. That's why big farms are moving this direction, and why companies like John Deere and Monsanto and other big agricultural corporations, and you can rail against them all you want, and there are fair criticisms of those corporations. Nevertheless, one of the things that they're doing well is the use of big data in order to implement precision agriculture to reduce our reliance upon these problematic inputs. Topsoil loss, also very problematic. We've talked about how mechanization is a contributor towards that. The more that we are stirring up the soil, the more we're tilling soils, the more we're spraying fertilizers and irrigating, the more you're getting water the more we're tilling again year after year after year without letting land rest, is leading towards topsoil loss on the order of 24 billion tons a year around the world. And this is really problematic because topsoil takes many, many years to accumulate naturally through natural processes. And we're not giving it the time to do that because we're using fields year after year. Pesticide use, also of great concern. Obviously, pesticides are chemicals designed to kill living organisms. And so they create a lot of problems. One, they do kill the organisms we're trying to kill, the pests that are coming after our crops, but they also kill things like pollinators, which we don't want them to do because they are poisons and they're neurotoxins, which means that pesticides have negative effects on humans as well. They're linked to cancer, birth defects, ADHD, Alzheimer's, etc. So particularly for farm workers who often are lower socioeconomic status, particularly for people living around agricultural areas, these are problematic. And we see development of pesticide resistance, where pests have become more and more resistant over time to different pesticides, requiring even stronger and stronger pesticides in order to deal with that. Concentrated animal feed operations, you saw there's just a paragraph, I think, in your book, and I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this. You could spend a lot, but this is the bulk of the animal products that you buy in our country, chicken, beef, pork, come from places like this. You know, if you don't know the farmer you're getting it from, it probably comes from something like this. And there's a lot of problems with, there's a lot of animal welfare problems. For one, that is one of the biggest areas of concern is that these animals don't have high quality of life. They have short lifespan, but there's also huge waste problems. Think about the amount of waste that is generated from a chicken facility or from a cattle farm like this. And what are they going to do with that? Often ends up in these big waste lagoons that creates a lot of local pollution, especially in the water tables locally. Lots of problems that come from this. Really just got this on here for a heads up on that. And your book refers to this term of treadmills of agriculture in order to look at some of the ways that sort of farmers become trapped today in this modern agricultural system. They're forced to adopt new technology just to keep up because all the other farmers are doing it. And in doing so, they're increasing their yields. So if all the other farmers are investing in new technology that's really expensive and more expensive equipment, that's forcing other farmers to do that to keep up as well, which sort of creates this loop and this trap of difficulty of staying up on it. Pesticide treadmill, insects are developing resistance to pesticides, which requires stronger pesticides, which develops more resistance, which requires stronger pesticides again. Fertilizers, the ongoing need of artificial fertilizers. Seed treadmill, the seed industry prevents farmers from saving their seeds. Most seeds, it's illegal for farmers to harvest and save those seeds and to replant them. They have to, again, buy them new every year, again and again. And we could spend a long time talking about the ethics of that, which would be a fascinating conversation. But you see how farmers today become sort of trapped in the, with these mechanisms in place, it becomes difficult to get out of that. We showed this a while back. I wanted to revisit it again to give context to what we eat is important. So we've talked about how meat has a higher impact on the environment than plant-based foods do. And if you remember, it has to do with this energy flow pyramid. So the lower on the food chain, the more energy is contained in there. So you lose energy as you go up the food chain. And if you remember, a lot of that has to do with metabolism. So creatures that eat primary producers or plants, a lot of the energy is lost as you go up the food chain in the form of heat and metabolism. It takes a lot of energy just to sustain a creature, a mouse, for example. And then it takes more energy to sustain something else further up. And the higher up you go, you're losing a lot of energy as you go along the way up. I feel like I described this better the first time around. Sorry, it's the end of the day today, almost 5 o'clock, getting kind of tired. The point being, you lose energy as you go up the food chain, which means that it's increasingly inefficient to eat higher on the food chain because a lot of energy was lost along the way just to sustain that creature. So that's the same reason why eating animal products is so much more inefficient. So from a carbon footprint perspective, for example, beef is much more inefficient than plant-based products. Beef and lamb are right up there at the very top in terms of the most inefficient or the highest carbon footprint impact. I think I said this before, I'm not a vegetarian and I won't tell anyone that they need to become a vegetarian, but I have significantly reduced my meat consumption, especially from beef, because it is such a environmentally harmful activity. So you can see the numbers here. Pork is a lot better. Chicken's a lot better, though these are all still high. Dairy products, any meat-based product is fairly high on its impact. Plant-based products are much better. Fish are better. Plant-based products much better. And generally, most vegetables are really down low on their impact. And a lot of the protein-based vegetables as well. So soy and nuts and other things, much smaller impact from a carbon footprint perspective. Same thing from a water perspective. The higher up the food chain you go, you got meats and animal products require a significant amount of water to produce those items compared to plant-based products, which are much less. And overall, everything requires more water than you would expect. Even a 1 liter bottled water, which I talked about in another, no, I think it's still coming up for you. Next one. I recorded some out of order. So yeah, it takes a lot of water, and it takes a lot more water the higher up the food chain you go. In short, if everyone on the planet adopted an American diet, it would be a big problem. The world would be out of water if everyone ate like Americans, because our food system is so water intensive. And what is this? Habitable land area used for food production. There is not enough habitable land in the world to produce the food we would need to feed the world like Americans eat. That's really problematic. That's ethically problematic, because you either have to say, I'm okay with the rest of the world not eating the way I do and not enjoying that luxury. Like, I'm okay. I think the rest of the world should not get the luxury of eating like I do. Fine with that. Or if you have a problem with that statement, and I hope you do, then it means what we're doing is wrong. It means that our level of consumption is ethically wrong. boy, that's really hard to fess up to and to own up to. So we need to rethink the way we eat. This is not to make you feel guilty. Well, maybe just a little bit. I think that there are small changes you can take over time to progressively move your dietary consumption toward a more sustainable manner. The point of this slide is to encourage us to consider the ethics behind our food choices. If it's not sustainable for the entire world to eat like we do, is it ethical for us to eat like we do? Maybe that's the question to leave you with to consider. Okay, a few other solutions I want to hit on before we're done here. Permaculture is this really cool idea. If you're looking for like, he keeps painting agriculture as the bad guy, I think there's a lot of great solutions in agriculture. Agriculture has the potential to capture carbon into the soil. It has the potential to feed people in a more nutritious and healthy way. It has the potential to end hunger and malnutrition across the world. But we need to do it in a way that works for society and that works for the planet as well. Permaculture is one of those interesting ideas that looks at how do you take advantage instead of fighting against nature, which a lot of agriculture is. You think about, where's a good picture to put with that? Like, there's nothing natural about this picture, right? If you think, what did this landscape used to look like? Well, it was probably a forest with a really diverse looking forest. We obviously had to fight against nature to create that there. And that there is what farms tend to look like today. Well, permaculture says we don't have to fight against nature to produce food. Instead, we can work with nature. So what permaculture does, it's done on a smaller scale. So obviously you don't have big combines and stuff. It's sort of, in some ways, anti-mechanization because you're replacing what could be done mechanically with human labor. But you're doing so in a way that enhances flourishing for the farmers and for the land and for the ecology around it. So you're intentionally putting diverse crops all together. So rather than specializing in one thing, you find a lot of different types of crops. And farmers who do this are often able to provide a significant portion of their, if not all of their food needs for the whole year themselves and for many other people as well. So it's anti-specialization. You have a lot of different crops organized into different zones and different areas. It takes advantage of natural resources like ponds or streams or wind breaks. It often incorporates trees into other crops as well. Usually includes some sort of animal agriculture in there as well, like goats or chickens. The point being to work with nature to enhance our food systems in a way that provides healthy, nutritious, and diverse food for people in a way that works with the environment around it. Look up, I wanted to show a video again here, I didn't have time. Look up permaculture farm tour videos. They are so cool. I couldn't find one that was like 3 minutes long, otherwise I would have put it in here. There's a lot of great ones like 15 minutes long. Permaculture farm tour. They're just really inspiring and interesting and a real movement toward this kind of agriculture as a way. Now, again, this requires a lot more human inputs. It requires people to shift from this idea of I need to work in an office to it's okay to go back and work on a small scale farm. And there's some benefits of doing so. So it does incorporate that kind of mentality, which is different. The other interesting solution I want to hit on is urban farming and agriculture. And there's a number of different ways that looks like. Part of that is taking abandoned plots of land in cities and turning them into community gardens and community farms. And you see a lot of that. Downtown Buffalo, I know of several. There's a lot of places that you see. Go to any urban city and find the part of town where there are abandoned plots of land, and likely you're going to see urban gardens popping up in those places. So that's a real great trend that is beneficial in a lot of ways, and in large part because people in cities are disconnected from food sources. We talked about how cities are really sustainable when considering our global needs for population. Densely populated cities are more sustainable than suburban areas, yet we still need food there. And the more food we can grow in those densely populated cities, the less requirement there is to bring food from far outside of it. Now we'll still have to go outside of it to get a lot of food. We can't grow in New York City, for example, everything we need for all New Yorkers to feed themselves, but we can grow some of that. And this is part of that. Rooftop farming is part of that as well. You're definitely seeing this trend towards rooftop farming because, hey, you've got this big space that's not being used for anything productive. And in fact, rooftop farming helps cool buildings because plants on the roof cool buildings rather than just the sun beating down on them, and turns it into productive space. And you're also getting these urban farms where, vertical farms, where you're growing things hydroponically in vertical farms. And that creates a much more efficient use of space as well, particularly in an increasingly urbanized world. This is a good use of space. There's a lot more you can put in there in terms of exciting solutions to agricultural challenges today. My hope is that you've been able to look at this and appreciate the many benefits that modern agriculture has brought to us, namely feeding the world and avoiding starvation, but also recognizing the sustainability challenges that are there and our need to change some of the ways that we're doing agriculture today, and the potential that some of these new technologies or approaches have in helping us do so. All right, we're going to stop it there. Thanks so much.